righteousness of the ordinary class of the people against what they would consider to be the owning class at the time. Mm-hmm. And the attitude, especially in European Western society, and the huge numbers of European immigrants coming into the United States, was that working people do not fight other working people on behalf of the owning class. This was a basic precept of class consciousness back then. You didn't need to know anything. This became a fundamental ethic. People today really don't understand this, of course, but this is the kind of perspective that gave rise to things like the Seattle General Strike, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the powers that be were already in the process of slowly, because technology was what it was back then, working towards World War. And preparing preparing the situation. And what may take a matter of months or only a few years now, back then would take many years or decades to really prepare. So, bear that in mind. Things move a little slower then. But the basic point was you cannot arm your respective populations to fight one another if you have not altered, through meme engineering, of course, altered their perspectives and consciousness. So suddenly, it took a while, of course, from this kind of very simple, ethical, class-conscious type perspective, there had to be something to compel people. First, it was patriotism, nationalism, this kind of thing. But really what did it came about in World War II. And prior to that, of course, was the rise of fascism in the world, and how that became such a convenient thing to vilify. So suddenly individuals who may have been just a decade prior advocating peace, advocating anti-war, advocating, this is not our war, said, oh, well, there's a really bad enemy in the world, and yes, this thing that's been implanted concerning democracy and everything, and freedom of speech, et cetera, is under threat. And so now we have a larger global threat that we can put aside our differences, whatever they may be, to fight this threat. Now, at the time, even though there were those with their suspicions, nobody knew that it was basically the same group of powers that be that were creating, fostering, and facilitating the what would be called the class consciousness, the left wing or social revolutionary or communist revolutionary perspectives, and funding them at the same time, fostering, facilitating, and funding what was then later to be called the tendencies toward fascism. Right. Which at the time was equated with brutal totalitarianism. And then, of course, it was also the same group of people that was essentially orchestrating the rise of modern-day imperialism as a political economic system of capital. Mm-hmm. And it was all the same groups. And this became more and more evident in countries like Africa, where you'd have in a place like Zimbabwe, blocks under one group, perhaps led under a Chinese flag, another group led under a Russian flag, another group led under the U.S. flag, but all still manipulated in the same way to control that territory. Mm-hmm. And depending on what was convenient at the time, there would be two-way alliances made. So eventually, it appeared as though the U.S. interests and Chinese interests decided to go against the Russian interests. But look who really dominates now. And this is just a simple example. And I bring all this up because it's very important to see beyond the appearances of things.
Right.
And those people who, and I was one of them many decades ago, as I specialized in the 60s in understanding the power structures and the social structures and all of this, and the theoretical and philosophic and economic underpinnings. I mean, this was my focus for positive change purposes and exposure. But these still never answered satisfactorily what the true nature of all of this was. So even though you could deconstruct these events later and look at them, we still had a couple of problems. One, huge numbers of people were led to believe, and adopted the false beliefs and, of course, accumulated traumatic memories as a result of their experiences to fight, quote, the good war against fascism.
Right.
Even if they didn't like capitalism very much, because then that was the only ideologic paradigm that existed with most people. And so if the hundreds of millions of people who died in the combination of global or international warfare over the 20th century is astonishing to tally it up. It doesn't matter how you add it up. The numbers are enormous. And the huge numbers of people who were tricked, essentially, into giving their lives and that of their families and everything for something that was totally false. What are they to do to reconcile this in their own minds? Does that mean their lives were lies? Unravel the thread a little farther. Does that mean everything their parents taught them were actually false? And the things that they sacrificed, because that was embedded in the consciousness of the masses of people, to sacrifice for the betterment of your children? And that carries forward to them. What have they taught their children? Who later, of course, many of whom, a small fraction of whom, opted to exit the system through countercultural type perspectives and experiments in the 60s. Well, this is a simple example. It's well enough understood. There's enough history there. But even to this day, it's very disturbing for people to consider that they fought and died for a complete lie. And that everything that they were brought up to, when you review popular culture, which is also, to those of us looking at this, meme engineering, to the extreme. And people don't know that the meme engineering process consciously, deliberately, systematically began at the same time, around the start of the 1900s. And so when we go forward to all of this, you can see how any of these major traumatic events in terms of the humanities concerned were manipulated by ostensibly human agencies. But then the question really is, what is it that was perhaps orchestrating them?
Right.
Because that's the only thing people could understand. And, it's like the one of the ultimate memes that has infiltrated into the spiritual New Age movement as well, or tendencies, actually, it was never really a movement, is that America was always the great hope and was the land of light and all of this kind of thing.
Right.
But it's almost inconceivable to think that before that as the first boatloads were arriving in their wretched condition on the shores of this continent, that there already was the notion of establishing essentially something that would be comparable to the Death Star planet of Star Wars tales.
Yes.
And that this particular continent would become the headquarters for that, and that as it's developed over time, it too would become disposable, which is what we're seeing now. I'll get into that briefly.
Okay.
And this is it's very important to see beyond the social reality why it isn't so much to become angry or upset. It's to see what it truly is all about.
Right.
And it's more important to take a look at some of the spiritual qualities to all of this. What has it all been about? Because we have very limited time this evening. I could talk for 2 hours on this topic, but
we'll get back. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's very important to kind of to skip ahead and get more of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
I know that of recent decades, there's been increased exposure of the role of various outside agencies in the manipulation of the human species. We'll set aside modern history for a moment here.
Okay.
And I'll get back to the Gulf of Mexico example, the other side of this dual aspect to it. So there's a matter of truth to a lot of that. But even that, it becomes a matter of pointing a finger, which ETs are good guys, which are bad guys. Were all the gods and lords of all the Bibles, the religions, and all of these things, were they all dark entities? Were they all ETs mistaken for something else, projected by humans? It's a mixture. of yes and no, to give a short answer to that. And the thing is that a few thousand years ago, there were those who tried to retain some knowledge of the deepest mysteries of existence and pass them along to the present. Pretty much it failed. I mean, it was a tough task.
Right.
And there were many distortions. Very often these deeper truths were manipulated inadvertently or very deliberately and conveniently, so that the truth became the lies and all of this.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's very important for people not to presume that they got the whole picture.
Oh, yes.
Now, there were many things developed to help control humanity over the recent millennia. Religions were very, very important, and they all emanate from the same sources. None of them were differentiated. They were just different flavors, not unlike fascism, communism, capitalism, all emanating from necessarily non-human sources, but with human agency helping to shape it, of course.
Right.
We need to give it the real-world touch, after all. But that was also anticipated that at some point there would be enough of the population who would begin questioning, looking outside the box. Perhaps those control systems themselves would break down.
Right.
So initially a solution was, let's create competing religions. But it was no different than the forces that manipulated global warfare. And then even that they knew would wear thin with some. They go, this is all starting to sound pretty much like the same deal. And they start looking outside the box. So somebody very clever had to start thinking, what will we have outside the box? And so in the mid-1800s, these new modern alternate religions were created, one of which, of course, was known as theosophy, and that fed into many other things and was essentially the foundations for the entire New Age tendencies.
Right.
And, it was well thought out. I got to hand it to them, And it was many, many, many different ways as more and more people were to seek ways to look outside the box. Always something else, but you've never left the box. It's like an infinitely expanding maze, and it starts looking like the Matrix movie.
Yes.
And, and then, of course, some people started looking at spiritual matters, saying, well, okay, this is beyond human. So what else is there? Is there a way out of here? And the notion of a transcendent, being able to transcend this spiritually, the consciousness. So there was a huge interest in consciousness and ways to transcend this reality, knowing that there was something not right about it, even though no one knew what it was. And so, from the 60s also, this was pursued not only by earnest and honest seekers, but also by the powers that be and agencies that were very non-human as well. So we get to this stage, and there were very few spiritual teachers who even understood this whole shell game that was going on. And I'm reviewing the work of a couple here who I've had a high regard for, and they came the closest to at least knowing the difference. The question is, what did they do with their work, and objectively, regardless of their intent, what did it serve is why I'm reviewing all this again 20 years later. Fresh perspective, I guess. What may have been inspiring and helpful once, perhaps I need to look at it a little differently again. So this was a very, very a very tricky situation. And as soon as you thought you understood something new was up there. And I would just say that that those who have in the recent decades had near-death experiences or similar kinds of experiences, of them, I'm not saying all, of them, a small percentage had very profound ones, where they actually were in connection, in contact with what exists outside of the fallen realms, to get back to your first point. What exists outside of this, that is beyond this universe. This is immense. And this touches upon, really, one of the greatest